It started on a calm spring morning, the kind where the sun gently filters through the blinds and the scent of blooming jasmine drifts through the open windows. Life in Maplewood Estates was predictable, almost sterile in its uniform perfection. Every house stood in pristine alignment, painted in shades approved by the Homeowners Association, lawns trimmed to regulation height, and every mailbox identical down to the bolt. It was a community obsessed with appearances, a place where individuality was quietly discouraged and conformity was rewarded with polite smiles. For years, Mason had lived quietly in his 2-story suburban home, keeping to himself and tending to his modest backyard garden. It wasn't fancy, a few rose bushes, some herbs, and a small patch of vegetables. He found peace there, working the soil after long workdays, the rhythm of gardening becoming his therapy. Neighbors would sometimes wave, occasionally comment on how quaint his garden looked, but otherwise no one paid much attention. That changed the day he found the letter taped to his front door. It was an official notice from the Maplewood Estates HOA, the kind printed on thick paper, the logo embossed in gold at the top, as if to remind residents that the association held more power than they'd like to admit. The letter stated in cold, bureaucratic language that Mason's front yard violated community standards. The reasoning: unapproved decorative vegetation extending beyond property boundary and non-compliant landscaping arrangement. The letter ended with a fine, a $500 due within 15 days, or further action would be taken. Mason stood there on his porch for a long time, rereading the words. His garden, the one he'd lovingly cared for, that added a bit of color to an otherwise monotonous street. He looked around. Every other yard looked identical. Trimmed grass, a few ornamental bushes, sterile flower beds, and not a single sign of individuality. He had thought his garden made the neighborhood more beautiful, but apparently the HOA disagreed. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He sent an email to the HOA's management office, politely asking for clarification. A few days later, he received a short, curt reply. Your property has been reviewed and found to be in violation. Please correct the issue immediately to avoid additional fines. There was no explanation beyond that. No appeal. No discussion. As the days went by, Mason started to notice things he hadn't before. The way certain neighbors glanced at his house disapprovingly when they passed by. The smug satisfaction on the face of Mr. Hendricks, the HOA president, as he drove his golf cart down the street. The feeling that he was being watched, judged, for daring to be different. He began to understand that this wasn't about plants or boundaries. It was about control. Still, Mason tried to comply. He trimmed the hedges, removed a few decorative planters, and even sent photo updates to the HOA. But the next letter came anyway. This one was even more severe. Continued non-compliance. Immediate correction required or legal action may be initiated. The tone was harsher, colder, almost threatening. That was the moment something in him changed. For years, he had quietly accepted the rules of the HOA, the paint restrictions, the noise curfews, the endless list of regulations. But this fine, this petty punishment over a garden that hurt no one, was too much. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. Why should he be fined for bringing a little beauty to his community? Why should anyone be punished for expressing creativity? So Mason decided to fight back, but not in the way the HOA expected. He spent nights researching HOA laws, finding loopholes, reading about other homeowners who had pushed back successfully. What he found was that the HOA could regulate certain things, but not everything. And one particular clause stood out to him: landscaping arrangements designed for public benefit, including artistic or educational installations, may be subject to separate community evaluation before enforcement. That phrase, public benefit, sparked an idea that would soon spiral into something far bigger than he could have imagined. The next morning, Mason made a decision. If the HOA didn't like his garden, he'd give them a reason to talk about it. He'd turn his small patch of green into something no one could ignore, something that would make them regret ever sending that letter. He started sketching designs, researching plants, and watching videos about creative landscaping. His friends thought he was joking when he mentioned his plan to turn his yard into a living art piece. But Mason wasn't joking. He was serious. This was war, a quiet, lawful, beautifully creative war. He started by expanding his garden, not removing it. He planted new flowers, bright, wild varieties that spilled over the edges of his yard in waves of color. He added sculptures made from recycled materials, a winding stone path, and even a small pond. Neighbors stopped to stare as the transformation began, some intrigued, others horrified. Word spread quickly, and soon the HOA was buzzing with gossip. By the time the next HOA inspection came around, Mason's yard was no longer just a garden. It was a spectacle, a bold, defiant statement in the middle of uniform suburbia. And when the HOA's compliance officer arrived to take photos, Mason simply smiled from his porch, sipping coffee as the man scribbled notes furiously. That evening, another letter arrived, but this one was different. It wasn't just a fine. It was a warning. Your property is in gross violation of community standards. Remove all non-compliant structures and landscaping immediately or face escalating penalties, including potential legal action. The HOA had declared war, but Mason was ready for them. He had already documented everything, consulted with a lawyer, and most importantly, filed an application to designate his garden as a community artistic display, invoking the very clause the HOA had overlooked. As the sun set over Maplewood Estates, the neighborhood stood divided. Some residents whispered about how brave he was. Others complained that his garden was an eyesore. But one thing was certain, no one could ignore it anymore. And as Mason looked out at his yard, glowing in the golden evening light, he knew this was only the beginning. The HOA thought they could scare him into submission. But what they didn't know was that their attempt to silence him had only planted the seed of something far more powerful, something that would soon turn Maplewood Estates into a place the world would talk about. The following week, the entire neighborhood seemed to buzz with tension. What had once been a sleepy, quiet community now felt like a stage for a brewing confrontation. Every morning, Mason woke to see unfamiliar cars slowing down in front of his house, passengers leaning out to snap pictures or record videos. His once modest yard had become a spectacle, a riot of colors and textures that seemed to defy the strict uniformity of Maplewood Estates. The flowers bloomed in wild abundance, sunflowers stretching high above the hedges, cascades of ivy climbing trellises, and a mosaic of vibrant ground cover that shimmered like a painting. At the center of it all stood a small wooden sign that Mason had carved himself, the Freedom Garden, a living art exhibit. It was the name he'd registered in his application to the HOA and local township. And it was the detail that changed everything. The HOA board wasn't pleased. In fact, they were furious. By midweek, the HOA president, Mr. Hendricks, called for an emergency inspection. Mason watched from his porch as a small group of officials gathered at the edge of his driveway. Clipboards in hand, brows furrowed, whispering among themselves as they surveyed the scene. They walked the perimeter, snapping photos of every flower bed, every sculpture, every painted stone. Mason could hear snippets of their conversation, words like noncompliant, unauthorized, and potential escalation. It was clear they didn't see art, they saw rebellion. When the inspectors left, Mason returned inside, knowing what would come next. He didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, the HOA distributed a community-wide notice titled, Preserving the Booty of Maplewood Estates. In it, they condemned what they called unsanctioned alterations to neighborhood aesthetics and warned that actions are being taken to restore community harmony. Though the letter never mentioned Mason by name, everyone knew who it was about. By the following morning, the gossip had spread like wildfire. Some neighbors avoided him entirely, glaring as they drove by. Others stopped to quietly express support, saying they admired his courage. But the real shock came when a local journalist showed up at his door. She introduced herself as a reporter for the Maple County Chronicle. Apparently, someone had sent in photos of Mason's garden along with a copy of the HOA's notice. The headline the next day read, Homeowner fined for flowers, local man turns yard into art exhibit. The article painted Mason as both victim and visionary, a man standing up to overreaching HOA power. It detailed how he'd used a little-known clause to protect his right to creative landscaping. By the weekend, the story had gone viral on social media. Comments poured in from people all over the country, some cheering him on, others sharing their own HOA horror stories. Maplewood Estates had become famous, though not in the way its board intended. Within days, strangers began visiting in person. Cars parked along the curb as people walked through the neighborhood to see the Freedom Garden. Some took selfies, others left encouraging notes in Mason's mailbox. It was as if his small act of defiance had become a symbol of rebellion against every overly controlling HOA across America. The HOA board, however, saw it as a disaster. A week later, they called a special meeting at the community center. Flyers appeared on every doorstep, urging residents to discuss the ongoing noncompliance issue threatening property values. The tone was dire, almost theatrical. Mason didn't attend. He wasn't required to. But several neighbors later told him what happened. Apparently, Mr. Hendricks stood at the front of the room, waving a stack of printed photos of Mason's garden like evidence in a trial. He claimed the influx of visitors was a nuisance, that it was disrupting the peace and endangering neighborhood security. He argued that Mason's garden set a dangerous precedent. If one person could ignore the rules, what would stop others? But not everyone agreed. Some residents spoke up, saying the garden made the neighborhood more lively, that it brought joy to people and even boosted local attention. A few even mentioned that nearby stores had seen increased foot traffic because of visitors passing through. The meeting ended in shouting and confusion. The first time in years the HOA board had lost control of a discussion. Later that night, Mason received another letter. This one wasn't just a fine. It was a notice of escalated enforcement action. The HOA declared his property a public disturbance and gave him 72 hours to cease all exhibition activities. They claimed that the traffic, the visitors, and the attention had created a liability for the association. Mason sat on his porch, reading the letter under the soft glow of his garden lights. The koi pond reflected the night sky, and the scent of blooming jasmine filled the air, the same scent from that morning when it all began. He felt anger, yes, but also something else: determination. The HOA didn't understand that this had gone beyond him now. This wasn't just a fight over flowers. It was about the principle of ownership, the right to use one's property for something meaningful. He had the legal clause on his side, but he also had something far stronger: public opinion. The more the HOA pushed, the more people rallied behind him. The online coverage expanded. Bloggers wrote about him, and YouTube videos titled, "Man Turns HOA Fine into Tourist Attraction," gained hundreds of thousands of views. The HOA's reputation, once a source of local pride, was beginning to crumble under the weight of public ridicule. Memes circulated showing Mason's colorful garden beside Maplewood's uniform lawns with captions like, "Spot the soul." Meanwhile, visitors kept coming, families with kids, photographers, even small news crews. Mason began adding new features: a butterfly corner, a mini fountain, and hand-painted signs explaining each plant species. He wasn't charging anyone to visit, it was all open, free, and welcoming. His once ordinary suburban lot had transformed into something magical, and the HOA could do little to stop it without looking even worse. By the end of the month, Maplewood Estates was no longer known for its symmetry and perfection. It was known for being the neighborhood with the man who beat the HOA at its own game. But the battle was far from over. Behind the scenes, Mr. Hendricks and the board were plotting something bigger. They had begun contacting the county zoning office, hoping to find new grounds for enforcement, something that could override Mason's public benefit clause. And one quiet morning, as Mason watered his plants, a white envelope appeared in his mailbox, not from the HOA this time, but from the County Code Compliance Department. He opened it slowly, heart sinking as he read the words. The county was requesting an official inspection of his property to verify permit compliance and public accessibility conditions. The HOA had escalated the fight to a whole new level. Mason looked around his blooming paradise, now teeming with life, and knew what this meant. They wanted to shut him down for good. But he wasn't about to let them win. The real war for the Freedom Garden had just begun. By the time the county inspection notice arrived, Mason's garden had already become a local sensation. What began as a personal act of defiance had evolved into something resembling a small community landmark. Every evening, families would stroll down the street just to see it. Photographers set up tripods at sunset, and even local art students came to sketch the layout. Mason's once quiet home had turned into a place of constant movement and life. But beneath that cheerful surface, pressure was building. The letter from the county was formal and bureaucratic, stamped with an official seal that made Mason's stomach twist. It stated that his property was under review for potential violations of county zoning and safety regulations. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, and he was expected to be present. It was clear that this wasn't a random visit. The HOA had successfully escalated the matter to a higher authority. That week was tense. Mason spent his days preparing, not to dismantle his garden, but to defend it. He printed out all the paperwork, the registration of his Freedom Garden as a public art installation, the email exchanges with the HOA, and even the article from the Maple County Chronicle that described the positive community impact. He knew he couldn't rely on emotions alone. He needed facts, legality, and documentation. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down on its campaign against him. Mr. Hendricks began sending out weekly bulletins to residents, framing the situation as a community crisis. He claimed that Mason's garden had caused increased traffic, endangered pedestrians, and negatively affected home values. The bulletins grew more desperate with each release, filled with exaggerated claims about safety hazards and unapproved structures. But for every person who believed them, two more rallied behind Mason. The day of the inspection arrived bright and warm. The morning sunlight poured over the garden, making every flower and sculpture shimmer like they were alive. Mason stood by his gate as two county inspectors arrived, a man and a woman, both wearing official vests and carrying clipboards. Behind them, parked discreetly down the street, was Mr. Hendricks in his golf cart, pretending not to watch while clearly observing everything. The inspectors were professional but stern. They walked the property slowly, taking photos and making notes. They examined the pond, the pathways, the wooden structures Mason had built. Every so often, they asked a quiet question about permits, drainage, accessibility. Mason answered calmly, showing them documents and explaining how every element was safe, self-contained, and compliant with community guidelines. He even showed the clause that allowed public benefit landscaping. To his surprise, they seemed impressed. One of them remarked that the garden was beautifully maintained, and environmentally friendly. They spent nearly an hour on site before thanking him for his cooperation and promising to deliver their findings in a few days. Mr. Hendricks drove off in visible frustration. For a few days afterward, Mason felt cautiously optimistic. The inspectors had seemed fair, not biased like the HOA board. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Not until the county's final report was issued. When the envelope arrived, Mason opened it with trembling hands. The verdict shocked everyone. The county had ruled that Mason's garden was not in violation of any zoning or safety codes. In fact, the report stated that it enhanced community engagement and demonstrated innovative use of residential space for artistic and environmental purposes. They even recommended that the local township consider recognizing it as an official community art and ecology site. It was a victory, and a public one. Within days, local news outlets picked up the story again. Headlines praised Mason for standing his ground and winning against HOA Overreach. The Maple County Chronicle ran another feature titled, "Freedom Garden Declared Legal. County Recognizes Artistic Landscaping." Mason's name became synonymous with creative resistance. His garden, once a personal retreat, had become a public symbol of individuality and defiance against unnecessary control. But while the public celebrated, the HOA seethed. Behind closed doors, Mr. Hendricks was furious. The county's ruling had humiliated the board. Their credibility was crumbling, and residents were beginning to question their leadership. Some even started discussing a recall election to remove the current board members. The HOA, which once commanded quiet obedience, was now divided. For the first time, Mason realized he had shifted the balance in the neighborhood. But victory brought new challenges. The increased attention meant more visitors than ever. On weekends, Mason's quiet cul-de-sac turned into a miniature fairground. Cars lined the streets, children played along the pathways, and sometimes small groups of tourists wandered through the garden with cameras. What had begun as a rebellion was becoming a full-fledged attraction, and managing it wasn't easy. Mason installed signs asking visitors to respect the plants and not step off the paths. He added small donation boxes to help maintain the space, though he still refused to charge admission. He even built a shaded seating area where people could rest and enjoy the view. The community was changing around him, local businesses benefited, residents began hosting yard sales, and Maplewood Estates became a name people searched online. Still, the HOA refused to concede. They began exploring new tactics: noise complaints, parking restrictions, even claims that Mason's visitors violated community tranquility guidelines. Each attempt failed under scrutiny, but it was clear they wouldn't stop. Then came the anonymous letters. At first, they were just notes, slipped into his mailbox or taped to his door. Some were supportive, others less so. "You're ruining our neighborhood," one read. Another said, "Go live somewhere else if you don't like rules." Mason tried to ignore them. But as weeks passed, the messages grew nastier, more personal. He started to suspect that someone on the HOA board was behind them. He decided to install cameras around his property, small, discreet ones tucked among the flowers and trees, not just for protection, but also to capture the reality of what was happening. That decision would soon pay off. One evening, while reviewing footage, Mason saw something that made his blood run cold. Around midnight, a shadowy figure crept up his driveway, carrying what looked like a paint can. The person approached one of his garden sculptures, a tall wooden centerpiece shaped like a tree of life, and began splashing red paint across it. Mason froze, watching the vandalism unfold on the screen. The footage wasn't clear enough to show the person's face, but the posture, the shape, and the familiar golf cap gave him a strong suspicion of who it might be. The next morning, the community woke to find Mason's garden defaced. Red paint dripped down the sculpture, splattered across flowers and stones. It was an act of malice, one meant to humiliate and destroy what he'd built. But instead of retreating, Mason called the local news station. They came within hours. That evening, the story aired under the headline, "Freedom Garden Vandalized. Homeowner Suspects Retaliation from HOA." The footage of the red paint, the destroyed flowers, and Mason's quiet determination sparked outrage. Viewers flooded the AOA's inbox with angry messages. Online forums lit up with discussions. And in the middle of it all, Mason stood firm, declaring that he would rebuild, repaint, and make the garden even bigger. And he did. Within days, volunteers from across the county came to help. Strangers brought flowers, seeds, and supplies. Artists donated sculptures. What had been vandalized turned into something even more beautiful, more vibrant, and undeniably more powerful. But the vandalism had consequences. The footage had sparked an investigation. And soon, whispers began circulating that the HOA board might be facing more trouble than they expected. Because when the sheriff's department got involved, the Freedom Garden wasn't the only thing under inspection anymore. The investigation began quietly, but the storm that followed would shake Maplewood Estates to its core. In the days after the vandalism, the community that once prided itself on silence and sameness could talk about nothing else. Everyone had an opinion. Some whispered that it was kids or outsiders who had done it, while others hinted at something far more serious, that the act had come from within their own neighborhood, from someone with motive, someone who stood to gain from discrediting Mason and his now famous Freedom Garden. The sheriff's office took the incident seriously. Mason had handed over the footage, and though it wasn't perfectly clear, it showed enough: the stature of the culprit, the angle of approach, the late night timing, and most tellingly, the familiar shape of a small electric vehicle at the end of the driveway to golf cart. Not many people in Maplewood owned one. In fact, there was only one person who drove one regularly, Mr. Hendricks, the HOA president. The revelation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Within days, investigators arrived at the OA office to collect security footage, records, and access logs. Though Mr. Hendricks denied any involvement, his demeanor changed. The once confident, self-assured leader of Maplewood Estates appeared suddenly defensive and paranoid. He canceled meetings, avoided residents, and was seen arguing with board members in his driveway late into the evening. Meanwhile, Mason's Freedom Garden had been restored to glory. The community rallied around him in ways no one had expected. Dozens of volunteers, people who had never spoken to him before, offered to help replant the damaged areas. Children painted signs that read, "Bloom Again, Freedom Garden," and local artists contributed new pieces to replace what had been ruined. Mason watched humbled, as the movement that started from a $500 fine grew into something that united people against the heavy-handedness of their HOA. But as the garden thrived, the HOA crumbled. Rumors began circulating that Mr. Hendricks had been under pressure for months, accused of mismanaging HOA funds and using fines as a personal revenue stream. Residents who had once feared speaking against him now came forward with their own grievances. Stories emerged of arbitrary fines, intimidation, and secret rule changes made without votes. It became clear that Mason's situation wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. Then came the bombshell. One evening, Mason received a phone call from a reporter who had been following his story since the beginning. She informed him that an anonymous source had leaked documents showing that the HOA had spent thousands of dollars on legal consultation fees connected to his case, money taken directly from community funds. The same report included invoices for private investigators and security monitoring services, all approved by Hendricks without the board's consent. When the story hit the news the next morning, Maplewood exploded. Residents stormed the next HO meeting demanding answers. The small community center was packed wall to wall, the air thick with frustration. Mason didn't attend, but he watched from his porch as the crowd gathered, neighbors shouting, holding up copies of the leak report, demanding Hendricks's resignation. For years, he had ruled through fear and manipulation. Now he stood before the people he once controlled, facing the consequences of his arrogance. By the end of that night, the board voted to suspend Hendricks' pending investigation. The crowd erupted in cheers. The reign of the HOA tyrant was over, at least for now. But even in his downfall, Hendricks wasn't done causing trouble. The following week, Mason noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted, engine idling for hours. When he approached, it drove off. Strange letters began arriving in his mailbox again, this time typed with no return address. "You think you've won." One read, "You've just made enemies." Mason wasn't easily shaken, but the tone was darker now, more personal. He began keeping detailed records of every interaction, every suspicious event, every strange sound at night. He'd learned enough about power to know that, like Hendricks, didn't let go easily. Still, there was more light than darkness now. The Freedom Garden was flourishing more than ever, and so was Mason's connection to his community. What had once been a quiet, walled-off neighborhood was now alive with collaboration. Neighbors began planting their own creative gardens, small, unique touches that brought color and life to every corner. It wasn't just Mason's rebellion anymore, it was a movement. The media attention only grew. Television crews arrived for interviews. Bloggers wrote think pieces about the garden that defeated the OA. Mason was invited to speak at a local environmental festival about sustainable design and community resilience. Each new story amplified his message, that individuality could thrive even in the most restrictive environments. But with fame came scrutiny. Reporters began digging deeper into Maplewood's history and the broader issue of HOA corruption across the state. Investigations uncovered other neighborhoods where boards had abused their power, misusing funds, targeting residents, and manipulating rules to suit personal agendas. Maplewood became the poster child for reform, and Mason found himself at the center of a growing debate about the role of HOAs in modern communities. The pressure on the remaining board members intensified. 2 resigned within weeks. By early summer, a recall election was officially announced. Mason didn't campaign for it. He didn't need to. The residents had already made up their minds. When the votes were counted, the entire board was removed. For the first time in the community's history, Maplewood Estates was without an HOA. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. Without the association's oversight, people began expressing themselves freely, repainting their doors, adding decorations, planning whatever they liked. For some, it was chaotic. For others, it was liberating. Mason watched with quiet satisfaction as Maplewood slowly transformed from a sterile suburb into something real, something human. Still, not everyone was happy. A small group of residents who preferred the old ways formed a temporary committee to preserve Maplewood's character. Among them were Hendrick's former allies, quietly trying to rebuild their influence. They filed complaints with the county, citing unregulated activity and property devaluation. But after the county's favorable ruling, their efforts went nowhere. It seemed Mason had finally won. The fines were gone, the garden thrived, and the community had awakened. For the first time in years, Maplewood felt like a place people wanted to live, not just exist. But peace is fragile. One late evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mason received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was simple: "You should have stopped when you could." Attached was a blurry photo, his house, taken from across the street at night. The fight wasn't over. Somewhere, someone still wanted revenge. And Mason knew deep down, the next battle wouldn't be about rules or fines. It would be personal. The summer heat had settled over Maplewood Estates, wrapping the neighborhood in a still, uneasy calm. The lawns shimmered beneath the relentless sun, and the hum of cicadas filled the air. On the surface, everything seemed peaceful. Children played in sprinklers, neighbors exchanged friendly waves, and the Freedom Garden bloomed brighter than ever, alive with bees and butterflies. But beneath that veneer of serenity, something darker was stirring. Mason could feel it, an undercurrent of tension that refused to fade. Since receiving that ominous email, he'd grown more cautious. He checked his cameras daily, locked his gates every night, and kept a flashlight near his bedside. Whoever had sent that message hadn't followed up, but the silence felt worse than the threat itself. It was the calm before the storm. He tried to distract himself by focusing on the garden. The community's enthusiasm hadn't waned. People still visited, leaving small tokens of appreciation. A handwritten thank you note, a bag of seeds, a painted rock with messages of hope. The Freedom Garden had become a sanctuary, not just for Mason but for anyone tired of conformity. It had drawn visitors from neighboring towns, even a few from out of state. Yet, with every new visitor, Mason noticed something strange. Lately, unfamiliar faces lingered longer than usual, wandering near his property after hours. Once he caught a man parked down the street taking photos. Not of the garden, but of his house. When Mason approached, the man drove off without a word. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. A few days later, Mason received a call from one of the remaining board members who had resigned after the recall election. She sounded nervous, her voice trembling. She told him that Hendricks had been seen in town again. He wasn't just back, he was organizing. The investigation into the vandalism had gone nowhere due to insufficient evidence, and with his suspension lifted, Hendricks was quietly reaching out to sympathetic homeowners, promising to restore order to Maplewood Estates. At first, Mason didn't believe it. Hendricks had been publicly humiliated. What could he possibly gain from returning? But then, flyers began to appear on doorsteps again, printed on the same thick paper, embossed with the familiar gold logo of the HOA. The message was simple: a vote to reinstate the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association for the safety, order, and prosperity of our community. It was signed by concerned residents for neighborhood integrity. But everyone knew whose hand was behind it. The backlash was immediate. Some residents tore the flyers in half and tossed them in the trash. Others, wary of the constant attention Maplewood had received since the Freedom Garden's fame, started to reconsider. They complained about the influx of tourists, the traffic, the noise, things that Hendricks had warned about long ago. He was weaponizing frustration, turning fatigue into fear. Soon, lines began to form again, not of unity this time, but of division. For every resident who celebrated freedom, there was another who longed for the old structure, the quiet control. Small arguments broke out in driveways, on sidewalks, even online community pages. What had once united Maplewood was now tearing it apart. Mason watched it all unfold with a growing sense of dread. He had fought to give people freedom, but now that freedom was being used to reopen old wounds. Hendricks was smart, manipulative even. He wasn't attacking Mason directly this time. Instead, he was planting seeds of resentment, letting others do the fighting for him. By early autumn, a petition circulated. Hendricks claimed that reinstating the HOA would protect property values and restore community order. The petition needed a majority vote to pass. At first, it seemed impossible. But as weeks went by, support grew faster than Mason could have imagined. Fear was a powerful motivator. Then came the town meeting, the one that would determine Maplewood's future. It was held in the same community center where Hendricks had once been forced to resign. Mason arrived early, sitting quietly in the back, watching as neighbors filled the room. Some nodded to him respectfully, others avoided his gaze. At the front stood Hendricks, impeccably dressed as always, his confident smile back in place. He began with a speech, smooth practiced, full of rhetoric about community pride and lost identity. He spoke of how Maplewood had once been a symbol of order and excellence, before it had descended into chaos. He painted Mason's Freedom Garden not as art, but as a reckless spectacle that turned our home into a circus. He talked about the noise, the visitors, the media, twisting every triumph into a failure. The crowd murmured. Some nodded along. Others looked uncomfortable. Then Hendricks dropped his final card, a new proposal. If reinstated, the HOA would create the Maplewood Heritage District, a designated area where non-traditional landscaping would be allowed. It sounded like a compromise, but Mason saw through it instantly. It was a trap, a way to confine creativity, to cage it within controlled boundaries while restoring his authority over everything else. When the time came for residents to speak, Mason rose. He didn't shout or accuse. He simply told his story, from the first fine to the vandalism, from the county victory to the restoration of the garden. He spoke about what Maplewood had become, a place of color, of life, of real community. He reminded them that no one had been hurt by freedom, but many had been hurt by control. The room fell silent when he finished. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny his sincerity. Then the vote began. Paper ballots were distributed. People marked their choices quietly. When the results were tallied, the tension in the room was unbearable. The final count was announced: reinstatement proposal, 48%. Opposed, 50%. Mason had won barely. The HOA would not return. Hendricks stood frozen at the front of the room, the color draining from his face. The crowd erupted into cheers, though some slipped away silently, bitter in defeat. Mason felt an overwhelming rush of relief, not joy exactly, but exhaustion. It was over, finally over. But as the meeting ended and people filed out, Hendricks lingered by the exit. As Mason passed, Hendricks leaned in close enough for only him to hear and whispered, "You haven't seen the last of me." Mason didn't respond. He just walked out, refusing to give the man another victory. The days that followed were quiet again. The Freedom Garden continued to bloom, though Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Hendricks had lost, yes, but the look in his eyes that night wasn't defeat. It was calculation. A week later, Mason came home to find his mailbox overflowing with envelopes. Inside each one was a copy of a legal notice addressed to him, complaint for damages, alleging property devaluation and public nuisance. The plaintiff's name printed at the bottom: Harold P. Hendricks. It wasn't over. It had never been over. The HOA might be gone, but Hendricks had found a new battlefield, the courtroom, and Mason, once again, would have to fight, not just for his garden this time, but for everything it had come to represent. The lawsuit hit Mason like a storm. A thick stack of papers arrived in a manila envelope, stamped and official, outlining Hendricks' accusations in dense legal language. He was suing Mason for property devaluation, public nuisance, and emotional distress, claiming that the Freedom Garden had turned the once exclusive Maplewood estates into public circus that scared away potential buyers and lowered home values. The amount he demanded in damages? $75,000. For a moment, Mason just stood in his living room, reading the words over and over. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but behind the absurdity was real danger. A lawsuit meant court fees, lawyers, and months, possibly years, of stress. Hendricks had found a new way to fight, not through rules or neighbors, but through the slow grind of the legal system. It wasn't about money, it was about breaking Mason down. But Mason wasn't the same man he had been when this all began. He wasn't the quiet homeowner tending to a small garden, afraid of fines and letters. He was the creator of the Freedom Garden, a man who had faced down an entire HOA and won. He had support now, not just from his neighbors but from people far beyond Maplewood. So, he decided to fight back. He contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and community rights. When she read through the lawsuit, she shook her head in disbelief. The claims were flimsy, based mostly on emotion and speculation. She assured Mason that the case could be beaten, and, if handled properly, could even backfire on Hendricks. The months that followed were grueling. Legal documents piled up, court dates shifted, and stress hung over Mason like a fog. Yet, through it all, the garden continued to grow. Every morning Mason found strength there. In the quiet rustle of leaves, the hum of bees, the bright colors that refused to fade. The Freedom Garden had become more than a backyard, it was a living testament to resilience. News of the lawsuit spread quickly. Once again, the story of Maplewood Estates found its way into headlines. SEO President sues man after losing control of neighborhood. Raid 1. Another said, the garden that the HOA can't kill. People online rallied behind Mason, starting fundraisers to help cover legal fees. Donations poured in from strangers across the country, people who saw themselves in his story, people who had fought their own battles against petty authority. Hendricks, however, doubled down. He hired an aggressive attorney and began pushing for media appearances, trying to spin the narrative in his favor. He painted himself as a victim of social media harassment, claiming that Mason's supporters had destroyed his reputation. But each time he spoke, the cracks in his story grew wider. His arrogance, once his greatest weapon, was now his downfall. When the court date finally arrived, the tension was palpable. The courtroom was packed, reporters, neighbors, curious onlookers. Mason sat quietly beside his lawyer, hands clasped, as Hendricks strutted to the plaintiff's table, chin lifted high. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, called the session to order. Hendricks' lawyer spoke first, delivering a dramatic monologue about property rights, community standards, and the sanctity of suburban harmony. He claimed that Mason's garden had turned the once exclusive Maplewood into a tourist trap, bringing strangers into a private community and creating visual pollution. The rhetoric was polished but hollow. It sounded less like law and more like bitterness dressed in formality. Then it was Mason's turn. His lawyer presented evidence, documents, photos, testimonials. She showed that the county had officially declared the garden legal and beneficial. She cited the rise in local tourism, the positive media coverage, and the increased property interest in surrounding areas. Then she played a short video montage. Clips of visitors smiling, families taking pictures, children planting flowers. The room went silent as the images of beauty and joy filled the screen. When the lights came back on, Mason's lawyer spoke simply. "This garden isn't a nuisance," she said. "It's a gift." The judge leaned back thoughtful. She asked a few pointed questions, mostly to Hendricks, about his history of HOA involvement, his prior fines, and his vandalism investigation. Each question seemed to chip away at his composure. His confident smile faltered. By the time closing arguments ended, it was clear the tide had turned. The decision came 2 weeks later. The court dismissed Hendricks' lawsuit in full. Not only that, but the judge ordered him to pay Mason's legal fees, citing frivolous litigation motivated by personal animosity. The ruling was scathing, describing Hendricks' actions as vindictive, retaliatory, and unbecoming of a community leader. It was, without question, the final blow. When the news broke, the reaction was explosive. Online, Mason was hailed as a hero again. Local news stations ran follow-up stories, and his garden became more popular than ever. Even national outlets picked it up, dubbing it the garden that beat the system. Tour buses occasionally stopped by, and schools began bringing students on field trips to learn about ecology and civic responsibility. Hendricks, meanwhile, vanished from public life. His house went up for sale within a month. Rumor had it he moved to another state somewhere without HOAs. No one in Maplewood missed him. In the months that followed, Maplewood Estates transformed completely. Without the iron grip of the HOA, creativity blossomed. Houses that once looked identical now bore unique touches. Painted shutters, murals, gardens of every kind. The neighborhood found balance again. A harmony built not on rules, but respect. As for Mason, the Freedom Garden continued to evolve. He added new sections, a butterfly conservatory, a meditation circle, and a small sign at the entrance that read, "What was once fined is now admired. What was once controlled now grows free." He never forgot what the fight had cost him, the sleepless nights, the stress, the uncertainty. But he also understood what it had given him: purpose, community, legacy. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last golden light touched the flowers, Mason stood at the edge of his yard, watching visitors wander through. The laughter of children echoed softly between the trees. He breathed in deeply, the air thick with the scent of lavender and earth, and smiled. From a single act of defiance, something extraordinary had bloomed. And though the HOA was gone, its memory lingered, not as fear, but as a reminder of what happens when one person decides to stand firm. Because sometimes it takes just one garden to change everything.